if I'm hearing this, if the ultimate goal is to have somebody outside who used to be in your facility,
Right.
go outside your facility and make a phone call or call someone, and have a conference, that's pretty simple. There are
Right.
solutions out there that would do that.
Sure.
It starts getting a little bit more problematic, or it starts getting a little more labor intense when
Mhm.
that remote worker has to do some kind of work with information or data that's in your network, right? Because
Absolutely.
now you've got to have some safeguards on that. You've got to make sure that that
Sure.
data is just as protected when that person's working within your facility as when they are working outside your facility.
Sure. And don't forget also, it also depends on what type of data you're talking about. If people are working with what's called PII, personally identifiable information, there are certain rules and regulations that you have to abide by. There's certain privacy issues you have to abide by. There are legal issues if you're dealing with health information. So again, the person has to be cognizant of what it is that they're working with and what their obligations are with this particular type of data.
So it's it, it's safe to say most companies have this type of practice already outlined. So internally, they've defined, this type of data requires this kind of security,
Mhm.
and an employee would need to be at this level to access. And,
Absolutely.
and that's typically
Absolutely.
how it's done. So I think one of the challenges that I've been hearing from some customers lately is that we're starting to see a time where now this big rush, right? Companies have set up time within their organization to do testing for maybe 25 users, 10% of their population. Now we're hearing and seeing some organizations bump that number up to 50%,
Right.
70%, 80%. I was talking to a client earlier this week, and they were talking about 100%. And so the questions that I started having, and we kind of touched on this earlier when we were doing another call, you know, if clients have their business continuity planning, or they've got their DR planning, um, then a lot of this should have already been considered. Right? There should be something in there.
Right.
It's tough to say though, because a lot of times that becomes, well, what's the trigger? Because if it's very easy, if you lose a building, if you lose connectivity, to hit a button and then everything goes the way it's supposed to go based on your
Right.
own business continuity or DR planning.
Hmm.
So then what happens if it gradually gets there? Like there's some problems. Like this is what we saw, where all of a sudden we were told, hey, you know what? People should work from home. And
Right.
the difference with that was all other avenues were still open. So
Sure.
physically they could get there. Technology-wise, there wasn't anything wrong. There wasn't an outage by the carrier. There wasn't a corrupt database. So that becomes more of this incident response. And
Absolutely.
and so then it comes down to, without picking on anybody, right? Is because you'd like to think that that was up to date, but if it wasn't up to date,
Sure.
and moving your workforce to remote, aside from the physical devices that you may have to order, aside from the additional logical um, programming or configuration or software you might have to bring in, and aside from going back and understanding the practice of your business, what is
Right.
secure, how is it secure, what type of data meets that, there's another logical physical transport, right? How
Hmm.
much bandwidth do you have that will allow your customers who are already using your network, for your remote workers to use your network?
Sure.
So especially if we're coming on VPNs, there's things like clients might have to worry about their concentrators. They might have to
Absolutely.
be concerned about
Hmm.
routing, routers, carrier
Yes.
bandwidth. So there's a lot there, and I didn't mean to go down that too far down
No,
that
no,
road.
but the reality is you touched upon a lot of basically critical aspects that unfortunately a lot of companies either don't do or they're behind in, where you've got incident response or incident response plans, you've got disaster recovery plans, you have business continuity plans, you have crisis management plans. Generally, the larger corporations have these things pretty much ironed out. Smaller companies, either don't have it at all, or they're, sort of, they've been written on paper, but they've never really been tested. This is critical. I mean, the thing is right now, especially cybersecurity, it's a lot harder now when people are working from home. Basically, your attack surface is sizable. It's a lot bigger now than it was before. So it's inherently difficult in knowing if someone, if they are who they say they are logging in online. What do you do if there are outages, things along those lines? So it's very, very difficult nowadays, and companies have to ensure that their plans are up to date. They're doing the right testing of it. They've got be it tabletop exercises, paper exercises. There are simulation type exercises. So the employers are working hard to protect the health and safety of the employees. Incident response requirements still remain in effect, is the bottom line. So and even if employees if they know of a particular breach or something bad that's happened, they still have to reach out to the company. Right now, I mean, obviously we're in trying times right now. It's a difficult situation right now that every company right now is in sort of crisis mode. And in all fairness, it's difficult to have expected, a pandemic, something like what's going on now. I mean, and I understand that. That's obviously very difficult, that it's not just your company that's under the gun, it's every single company that's under the gun. So obviously there are issues there. But your incident response plan is supposed to contain all the information required in outages, people working remotely. What do you do? What are the steps? What's the contact information? Who writes this down? Who actions it? Who's the project manager? Basically from A to Z, we're talking flow charts from A to Z of every single step, what needs to be done. Because the reality is, when something happens, you don't want to then say, hey, what should I do next? This should all be written out and tested. So it's difficult. There are huge numbers as far as companies right now that get breached and they have no idea what to do. They don't know. And when I'm talking about these incident response plans, I'm not just talking IT. You've got legal issues. You've got privacy issues. You've got issues where, for example, you might have to contact the police. You might have to contact news stations, whatever the case may be.
You're talking about triggers, right?
Absolutely.
So there's a breach, and it's not
Yep.
just what do we do with IT. It's
absolutely. Oh no,
who do we have to notify, and how do we move forward, and what's the process? Okay.
Correct.
Yeah,
and the thing is, especially nowadays, when you have these data breaches, there are different laws that come into effect. You've got in California something called CCPA. You've got in the different states, or in the United States, every state has their own laws as it pertains to breaches, and how much PPI information was let out, how many people were affected, how bad was it, and they all have different laws of what to do. And if you do business in Europe, for example, you've got GDPR, and different countries, have got different types of requirements. So again, all of this stuff needs to be integrated within your incident response plan in case things go bad. Because I can tell you right now, they always do. And the idea, of course, is to mitigate that risk and have something in place that you know what it is that you're doing in case of a crisis.
So a lot of times, I feel when we're talking about business continuity or disaster recovery or incident response, I think that people tend to compartmentalize that. Like business continuity is something like, a backhoe takes out a fiber link, and now, the lights are on, but nobody can talk, right? There's that.
Right.
And then disaster recovery, disaster is, a fire is some mishap where something gets damaged or destroyed. They don't always think of, the backhoe. That's not a disaster. So
not exactly. Sorry to correct you. The best way to look at it is this. A disaster recovery plan typically is IT in the most simplistic sense. IT went down. How do you get IT to go back up? That's in the most simplistic sense.
Okay.
Business continuity plan, or a BCP, includes all aspects of making sure that the company is up and running. So, for example, part of that would be a DRP. Think of a DRP as almost as a subset of a BCP. Okay? So the BCP, communications. If someone, God forbid, there's a shooting incident at one of your locations, this is BCP. Who do you contact? The police, the hospital, things along those lines. You lose power. Now, power, of course, if you lose that, It can involve both DR and BCP.
Okay.
Okay, but as a general, again, there's obviously a lot of you know specifics and details, but at a high level, DR is, I think of it as IT, whereas BCP is everything, basically to ensure that the business is up and running. DR is to ensure that that IT system has been restored in the least amount of time possible, based on the company should have done things like a business impact analysis to determine how long can systems be down for before you start losing money, that sort of thing.
Okay. And so how do you define incident response?
Well, incident response is, I mean, the best way to look at it is when something blows up, what do you now do? Again, obviously at a very, very high level,
Yeah.
what do you now do? What are the steps? I mean, the first step of incident response, to be honest, is preparedness. Ensure you're prepared for it, okay? And then there's all the steps involved of, remediating the issue and eradication and so on and so forth to get through it all the way up until root cause analysis to determine exactly what happened, what went wrong, and let's do something now such that this doesn't happen again. And it's an entire cycle, okay? But basically,
Okay.
in a nutshell, when something blows up, you're now ready, you've got all the steps involved in what to do.
So this would really be more of a incident response underneath business continuity, right? So
Absolutely, absolutely.
IT
It
still
involves all
works.
of it. It involves all of it. Absolutely. Again, incident response very often is related to IT, of how to bring IT systems back up. And again, the larger the company is, they might have a crisis management team, where incident response is only one aspect of crisis management, because crisis management would incorporate the police and legal and communications and all that sort of thing. Whereas incident response typically is more along the lines of pure disaster as far as IT goes.